what if the same force that shaped the fate of ancient Persia is still shaping the fate of Iran today? Not kings, not armies, not ideology, but geography. From the cliffs of Thermopylae to the narrow waters of Hormuz, history keeps returning to one brutal truth. Empires do not rise or fall only by strength. They rise or fall by who controls the passage. And for Iran, that passage has always meant survival, because when the world closes in, when enemies gather, when trade, oil, fleets, and fear all collide in one narrow corridor, that corridor stops being a map detail. It becomes a weapon. It becomes leverage. It becomes destiny. For thousands of years, Persia understood something most empires learned too late. Geography can be more powerful than sheer military force. The ancient Persians fought in a world where mountains, seas, straits, and invasion routes could decide whether an empire expanded or collapsed. The Greeks knew it, the Romans knew it, and today the modern world knows it too, because in 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway near Iran, it is one of the most dangerous and strategically important choke points on Earth, a narrow passage where global energy, military deterrence, naval power, and geopolitical pressure all meet face to face. This is what makes Iran different. It is not just a country with a military, it is a state sitting on one of the most decisive pressure points in modern history. Just as ancient Persia once stood at the center of the old world's great strategic crossroads. In this video, we are going to connect two worlds that seem centuries apart but are tied by the same logic of war. From Salamis and Thermopylae to tankers, missiles, and Hormuz. From ancient choke points that decided the fate of empires to the modern corridor that could shake the entire global order. And once you see that connection, Iran stops looking like just another modern conflict zone. It starts looking like something far more dangerous. A civilization that has been fighting the same strategic battle for survival for over 2,000 years. To understand why Hormuz matters in 2026, you have to go back to a truth the ancient Persians learned early. War is rarely decided only by the size of an army. More often, it is decided by where that army can move, where supplies can pass, and where an enemy can be trapped, delayed, or broken. That was the hidden logic behind the ancient struggle between Persia and the Greek world. Persia was larger, richer, and vastly more powerful on paper. It had manpower, resources, and imperial reach stretching across continents. But when that power had to move through narrow spaces, its strength stopped looking limitless. It became vulnerable. At Thermopylae, a massive Persian force was forced into a confined battlefield where numbers could not be fully unleashed. The terrain stripped away part of Persia's advantage and turned geography into a weapon for the defenders. It was not just a fight between armies. It was a fight over space itself, over who could use a narrow passage to reshape the balance of power. And then came Salamis. There, the lesson became even more brutal. Persia's enormous imperial power met a battlefield that refused to reward size alone. In the tight waters near Salamis, maneuverability, local knowledge, and positional control mattered more than raw scale. A stronger empire entered the trap with confidence. It left with its aura of invincibility shattered. That is the pattern most people miss. The Persians were not weak, their commanders were not blind, their empire was not fragile. But even great powers can be forced into disadvantage when geography narrows their options, when movement is restricted, when timing becomes everything, when one corridor decides the pace of battle, strategy changes, every decision becomes heavier. Every miscalculation becomes fatal. Now fast forward to the present. The Strait of Hormuz is not a battlefield in the ancient sense, but strategically it works by the same terrifying principle. It is narrow, it is vital, and it concentrates risk in a way few places on Earth can. A huge share of the world's energy supply moves through a passage that is small enough to be threatened, pressured, monitored, and potentially disrupted. That means Hormuz is more than a shipping route. It is a pressure chamber. And for Iran, that changes everything. Because Iran does not need to dominate the whole world's oceans to matter. It does not need a navy that rivals every superpower fleet ship for ship. Just like in the ancient world, it only needs to sit beside a narrow point where the flow of power can be slowed, threatened, or turned into leverage. This is where the old Persian logic begins to feel very modern. When a state lives next to a choke point, it learns to think differently. It learns that survival is not always about conquest. Sometimes it is about position. Sometimes it is about making the cost of attacking you too high. Sometimes it is about reminding stronger enemies that they may have more firepower, but they still have to pass through the corridor you can touch. And that is exactly why Iran's military doctrine cannot be understood as random aggression or simple posturing. It grows out of geography, it grows out of vulnerability, and above all, it grows out of a strategic memory the Persian world has lived with for centuries. If you control the passage, you can shape the war before the first full battle even begins. But control of a choke point is never absolute, and in both the ancient world and the modern one, the real question is always the same. What happens when both sides know the passage decides everything? The answer is where the tension truly begins. In the next part, the corridor stops being geography and becomes a weapon. When both sides understand that a narrow passage can decide the balance of power, the choke point stops being just a location on the map. It becomes part of military doctrine. It becomes part of diplomacy, and eventually it becomes part of psychological warfare. That is exactly what happened with Iran. For Tehran, Hormuz is not valuable because it guarantees victory in a conventional war. It is valuable because it gives Iran something smaller powers have always needed when facing stronger enemies: the ability to impose uncertainty. And in war, uncertainty can be as powerful as firepower. This is why Iran built its strategy around asymmetry. Instead of trying to mirror the military structure of the United States or compete head-to-head with the largest navies on Earth, Iran developed a different logic: fast attack craft, coastal missile batteries, naval mines, drones, swarm tactics, layered denial. The goal is not to dominate open oceans. The goal is to make a narrow corridor feel dangerous enough that every commander, every tanker captain, and every government has to think twice. That is the modern version of choke point warfare. Not necessarily closing the passage completely, not necessarily launching a full-scale naval battle, but creating a permanent shadow over the water. A shadow that says, if pressure rises high enough, this corridor can become chaos, and that threat alone carries enormous weight because the Strait of Hormuz is one of those rare places where local tension can become global panic in a matter of hours. A single incident there does not stay regional for long. Insurance prices jump, oil markets react, navies reposition, intelligence services go on alert, political rhetoric hardens. In a world built on energy flow and fragile confidence, a narrow channel can trigger consequences far beyond the battlefield. That is why Hormuz gives Iran leverage far beyond its conventional size, and this is where the ancient echo becomes impossible to ignore. In the old world, empires feared the loss of key routes because routes meant movement, trade, communication, reinforcement, survival. In the modern world, the principle is the same, only now the stakes are measured not just in soldiers and ships, but in fuel prices, global markets, alliance credibility, and the risk of wider war. So when Iran signals its ability to threaten Hormuz, it is not only making a military statement, it is making a civilizational statement. It is reminding the world of something Persia understood long before modern geopolitics had a name. If your land sits beside the gate, then even stronger powers must respect the gatekeeper. But choke points do not only empower the defender, they also create a trap, because the same corridor that gives Iran leverage also makes Iran itself the center of constant surveillance, constant pressure, and constant contingency planning. Every movement is watched, every exercise is interpreted, every missile test, every naval patrol, every regional escalation is read through the same question: is this the moment the corridor ignites? That is the burden of living beside the world's most dangerous doorway, and history shows that once a choke point becomes central enough, it stops belonging only to the country next to it. Other powers begin preparing for it. War games are built around it. Fleets are positioned because of it. Alliances harden around it. The corridor becomes international before the shooting even starts. So the deeper truth is this: Hormuz is not just Iran's advantage, it is also Iran's permanent risk. Because the more valuable the passage becomes, the more the entire world starts treating it as a place where no mistake can be allowed, and where eventually one mistake may become inevitable. And when that moment comes, the fight is no longer about ships alone. It becomes a contest of nerves, timing, and political will. In the next part, we enter the most dangerous phase of all, when deterrence starts looking exactly like the opening move of war. This is where the story turns darker, because most wars do not begin with a clean declaration. They begin in the gray zone, in the space between warning and action, between deterrence and provocation, between a move meant to prevent war and a move that suddenly makes war unavoidable. That is exactly what makes Hormuz so dangerous. Every military power in the region says it wants stability there. Every government understands the cost of chaos. Every navy knows that a real disruption in the strait could send shockwaves across the global economy. And yet, the very measures designed to prevent that disruption can make the situation more explosive. A warship enters the area to deter aggression. Iran answers with patrol boats and missile readiness. Surveillance increases, flights intensify, signals are intercepted, exercises are announced, warnings are issued, and slowly the line between defense and preparation for attack begins to disappear. This is the paradox of chokepoint warfare. The narrower the corridor, the less room there is for misunderstanding. But the less room there is physically, the more pressure builds politically and militarily. Every move feels closer, every encounter feels sharper, every signal feels heavier than it would anywhere else. That is why a place like Hormuz does not need a full invasion plan to become dangerous. It only needs friction, a misread radar track, a commander under pressure, a drone flying too close, a warning shot, a seizure, a retaliation. In a corridor this tight, escalation does not unfold slowly, it compresses. And this is where modern Iran resembles ancient Persia in a way few people fully appreciate. Ancient Persia lived under the pressure of defending strategic routes while facing rival powers determined to contain, weaken, or outmaneuver it. It had to think not only in terms of conquest, but in terms of endurance. It had to ask the question every vulnerable but strategically positioned power asks. How do you survive when stronger enemies can approach, but cannot afford to ignore you? Modern Iran asks the same question. Its answer has not been to seek equal strength in every category. It has been to become dangerous in the categories that matter most inside a confined strategic space. That is why the doctrine is built around deterrence by disruption. Not because Iran expects to win a simple conventional showdown in open waters, but because it understands that the battle is not only about destruction, it is about cost. It is about hesitation. It is about forcing stronger adversaries to calculate consequences before they act. And once that logic takes over, every confrontation becomes a game of nerve. Who blinks first? Who overreacts first? Who believes the other side is bluffing, and who makes the fatal mistake of finding out? That is the real battlefield in Hormuz. Not just ships against ships, not just missiles against defense systems, but calculation against calculation. Because once both sides rely on deterrence, the most dangerous moment is not when one side feels weak. It is when both sides feel they must look strong at the same time. That is when symbolism becomes combustible. That is when restraint starts looking like weakness. That is when military posture becomes political theater with live ammunition behind it. And history is full of powers that believed they were managing escalation right up until the moment escalation began managing them. That is why Hormuz matters far beyond oil or naval maps. It is the modern stage where geography, fear, doctrine, and reputation collide in real time. A place where ancient strategic logic survives inside satellites, missiles, drones, and global media. A place where one narrow corridor can force world powers and a regional state into the same old trap. Both know the passage matters too much to lose. And that makes it even harder to step back, which leads to the final and most uncomfortable truth. The struggle over Hormuz is not really about who owns the water. It is about who can endure the pressure of standing closest to the spark. In the next part, we reach the final transformation. And the reason Iran's story is not just modern geopolitics, but the continuation of an ancient strategic destiny. And that is the final transformation of this story. When you look at Iran only through the lens of modern headlines, you see sanctions, missiles, naval patrols, proxy networks, nuclear tension, and oil politics. You see a state locked in confrontation with stronger powers, trying to hold ground in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. But when you pull the camera back, the picture changes. Because Iran is not just acting inside a modern crisis, it is operating inside a pattern that is far older than the modern world itself. A pattern shaped by geography, by exposure, by encirclement, and by the permanent reality of living beside routes that other powers cannot afford to lose. That is what links Thermopylae, Salamis, and Hormuz. Not because they are identical, not because ancient Persia and modern Iran are the same state, but because the strategic logic never truly disappeared. In every era, the same question returns. What happens when a great struggle is forced through a narrow space? In the ancient world, that answer reshaped shaped empires. In the modern world, it can shake the global economy, trigger military escalation, and redraw the balance of power without a single full-scale invasion ever taking place. That is why Hormuz matters so much. It is not just a shipping lane. It is not just a military flashpoint. It is the place where geography still dictates strategy with ancient brutality, a place where position can rival power, where leverage can outrun size, where the side closest to the corridor may also be the side living closest to catastrophe, and that may be the deepest lesson of all. For more than 2,000 years, the Persian world has lived with the burden and advantage of being placed at the center of decisive routes. That position has brought wealth, influence, invasion, pressure, and survival all at once. It has forced rulers, generals, and states to think not only about victory, but about endurance. Not only about expansion, but about what it takes to remain unbroken when history keeps pushing through your front door. That is the story of Iran in 2026. Not simply a country threatening a strait, but a civilization still shaped by the same strategic truth that defined its ancient wars. When the passage is narrow enough, the entire world eventually feels its weight, and that is why the next crisis in Hormuz will never be just another regional incident. It will be the latest chapter in one of history's oldest military realities. That choke points do not just control movement, they control destiny. If this changed the way you see Iran, leave a comment with your view, like the video, and subscribe for more deep military storytelling.